I'm just going to spend a couple minutes here, just first of all, since this is the Regna Darnell Distinguished Lecture, to introduce Regna, and so we all know her well, and to talk a little bit about the theme of the lecture series. So Regna came to Western in 1990 from the University of Alberta, where she had established an international reputation as a scholar of Cree language and culture. Once here, she shifted her focus to languages and cultures of Southwestern Ontario, and was the founding director for the Centre of Research and Teaching of Canadian Native Languages, and then the founding director for Western's First Nation Studies program. Over the years, she expanded her research focus to include other topics, including cultural theory, the history of anthropology, First Nations ecosystem health, the nomadic legacies of First Nations individuals, and finally, she returned to the subject of her doctoral dissertation, Franz Boas, by initiating the Franz Boas Papers Project, which was funded by a shared partnership grant. Regna's research has garnered international recognition, including a number of very impressive awards, including fellowship with the Royal Society of Canada, Western's Helmuth and Distinguished University Professor Prizes, a Killam Research Fellowship, and a Premier's Distinction Award for the Social Sciences and Humanities. Her interdisciplinary and collaborative approach to academia can be seen in her affiliations that include the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, Center for Theory and Criticism, Center for Ecosystem Health, and the Master of Public Health program. She also has an impressive record of service to the university and academia, including 2 terms as president of our faculty association, president of Canadian Anthropology Society, and a variety of other academic organizations. Her dedication to teaching is well known. For example, over the last decade, she supervised 13 doctoral and 3 MA theses. And in addition, she recently established the Regna Darnell Graduate Award for Fieldwork in Sociocultural Anthropology, which provides critical support for student recruitment and retention. Tonight, we're here for the Regna Darnell Distinguished Lecture in Theory, Ethnography, and Activism in Anthropology, which Regna established in 2017. The objective of this lecture series is to bring internationally recognized anthropologists to the department, such as Dr. Povinelli. The title of the series reflects the underpinnings of Regna's career, focus on theory, ethnography, and activism. In the realm of theory, anthropologists need to draw on theoretical concepts and approaches from across the social sciences, humanities, and sciences. A critical part of Regna's approach to anthropology is the use of ethnography, including participant observation and long-term community engagement. And finally, the series reflects Regna's belief that anthropologists should be activists, with collaborative anthropology holding key to giving voice to people we work with to work towards decolonization. The Department of Anthropology is very grateful for Regna's contributions to scholarship, teaching, and service, and for establishing this excellent speaker series that brings Povinelli to us this evening. So with that, I will actually pass the screen over to Regna, and she's going to say a few words about Franz Boas.
Thank you, Andrew. Virtually every anthropologist knows something about Franz Boas, but very few know much about why he remains a seminal figure, or about the interdisciplinary German tradition of physics, geography, and ethnology that he imported to North America. History of anthropology is only one possible approach to present-day challenges, but it provides a valuable lens on Boas and on our discipline. As an historian of anthropology coming to terms with his legacy, as general editor of the Franz Boas documentary edition over the last decade, I foreground his stature as a public intellectual, addressing the importance of science as evidence-based methodology deployed in a distinctively anthropological voice. The key is transportable knowledge. His paradigm statement, The Mind of Primitive Man, was virtually unchanged from 1911 to its revised edition in 1938, except that race in America became anti-Semitism in his argument for universal human capacity based on the defamiliarization of cross-cultural examples across time and space. This voice stands the test of time as an exhortation to critical thought that transcends any particular case. Mind of Primitive Man identified single-generation plasticity in head form, concluded that culture rather than race must be the cause of human diversity, and transposed plasticity to a fluid amalgam of culture, environment, and history that reoriented his work and that of his students toward the sociocultural, subdisciplinary scope still associated with the Americanist tradition. Boas taught us to generalize or theorize from qualitative ethnographic research, to value the native point of view, or two-eyed seeing, accessible through collaborative partnerships with indigenous language speakers and knowledge keepers, establishing a textual database that is still critical to linguistic and cultural revitalization. He incorporated Black, Hispanic, and Asian communities and intervened frequently in public policy. He made errors in judgment in terms of contemporary standards on many fronts, but to jettison his contribution, as many have recently proposed, is assassination by anachronism. Boas's prescient appreciation of the inevitable flux of human social and political change led him to a mixed, chaotic, rhizomatic, and incomplete model of complex intersecting variables that continues to resonate and applies equally within our discipline and beyond the walls of the academy. He deemed activism a scholar's obligation to apply science in the service of an emergent global future. I endowed this lecture series to preserve this legacy, this Boasian legacy, for future generations of students at Western.
Take it away, Greg. Thanks very much for that, Regna.
All right, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Povinelli. Dr. Povinelli is the Franz Boas Professor of Anthropology and Gender Studies at Columbia University, where she has also been the director of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender and the co-director of the Center for the Study of Law and Culture. Dr. Povinelli is a critical theorist and filmmaker. Her critical writing has focused on developing a theory of late settler liberalism that would support an anthropology of the otherwise. This potential theory has unfolded across numerous books and essays and 35 years of collaboration with her Indigenous colleagues in North Australia, including most recently 6 films that they've created as members of the Caribbean Film Collective. The Caribbean films that they have made have been awarded numerous prizes as well. In 2015, they received the Visible Award. In 2015, also the Cinema Nova Award for Best Short Fiction Film. They've been featured at the Melbourne International Film Festival and have been shown internationally in all kinds of places, including the Berlinale Forum Expanded, the Sydney Biennial, the Tate Modern, and the MoMA in New York. Among Dr. Povinelli's extensive publications are 5 books. The first, in 1994, Labor's Lot, The Power, History, and Culture of Aboriginal Action. Then The Cunning of Recognition, Indigenous Alterities and the Making of Australian Multiculturalism, which was an Art Forum Best Book of the Year. Empire of Love, Toward a Theory of Intimacy, Genealogy, and Carnality. Economies of Abandonment, Social Belonging and Endurance in Late Liberalism. And most recently, Geontologies, A Requiem to Late Liberalism, which was the recipient of the 2017 Lionel Trilling Book Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Povinelli.
There you go. That helps. Thank you for inviting me. And Regna, thank you for a really great introduction to the work and legacy of Boas, which I think you just really get why his legacy continues to be so important. And also it's an honor to give a lecture under Regna's sign, given the incredible work she's done over the years across fields within anthropology, but also her work supporting graduate students and intellectual public life like this lecture, but not only this lecture series. So it's a real honor, and I'm really delighted to be here. Before I start, can you is this sound working fine? Everybody is cool? All righty. So today, what I want to do today, in the time I have, is to provide a brief outline of the end of art, or the ends of art, for the Karabing Film Collective, of which I'm a part. So I'm going to begin in the late afternoon of the dry season of 2009. I'm sitting at a fire, around a fire at Bulgo, which is a small indigenous community on the coast, some 250 kilometers southwest as the crow flies from Darwin in the Northern Territory of Australia. And I'm sitting with 15 other indigenous men and women in their 30s and 40s. Now, in 2009, we had known each other for 24 years. It's now 37 years. Time flies. We grew up together. We were taught the broad and specific analytics of existence, or what we could call the ancestral present of the land we were sitting on and the land surrounding the lands we were sitting on, by the same parents and grandparents. Their parents and grandparents taught them and us together. I arrive at Bellion, which is another small indigenous community on the Cox Peninsula, just across the harbor from Darwin, in 1984, having just gotten a BA in philosophy from St. John's College in Santa Fe. The folks sitting around that fire at Bulgo on the coast represented 7 different, what anthropologists call, and now Karabing uses this term because we think as Gavin Bionamu says, white people understand it if you say this word. They represented, and around this fire were represented 7 totemic groups, and thus 7 clan groups with 7 different clan areas, as well as 5 language groups. Those totemic groups and language groups stretch across the lands, just across the harbor, the Darwin Harbor, following the coast all the way down some 500 kilometers. Now, why were we sitting at this fire? We were sitting there because of the explosive combination of the land rights, the history of the Land Rights Act, and the impact of a new piece of legislation commonly called in Australia, and definitely in the Northern Territory, the intervention. The explosive combination of these 2 acts on this group of men and women and their kids' lives. So let me say just a couple words about what these 2 acts were, and then the impact they had. So the Land Rights Act was passed, or the Aboriginal Land Rights Act of the Northern Territory 1976 was passed in 1976. And it was part of, or it was one of the first pieces of legislation heralded as a new moment in Australian relations to its Indigenous subjects. It was heralded as a moment in which the state recognized the potential self-determining desires of its Indigenous people in the North. Specifically, the Land Rights Act sought to recognize Indigenous traditional owners for land. And I talk about this more in the cunning of recognition. I'm just going to give a brief overline just to see, because I need to, in order for us to understand what the ends of the Karabing art is, you got to understand where this comes from, okay? So however, since 1976, it's become apparent, if it wasn't so in 1976, that this mode of recognition is a way the state developed for articulating local Indigenous modes of human and more than human relations to proprietary logics. So Cottabing member Rex Edmonds describes the Land Rights Act, its function, its legacy, as the beginning of a shift in a form of antagonism that was defined by indigenous people against the settler state to intra-indigenous antagonism, in which indigenous people started fighting each other through the Land Rights Act for a piece of the pie. Now, Rex's analysis is situated in a long experience. So he was describing this in a film we made called The Riot, which gave the origins of Cottabing. His analysis of the Land Rights Act comes from very long experience, because in 1976, at the moment this Land Rights Act was passed, the entire Cox Peninsula, on which, remember, Bellewain, so we're talking about two communities, Bulgull down the coast and Bellewain right across the harbor from Darwin. The area around Bellewain was placed under a land claim, the Kenby land claim. Now, the Bellewain land claim was where those 15 adults in the 30s and 40s had been born, had grown up, had gone through ceremony, had been told that this was part of their flesh and blood, part of the way they were connected to lands. But the Land Right Act demanded a certain kind of human, more than human relation to land, based on a very conservative social anthropological model of totem clan land. Right. So what the land rights did in effect in the Kenby land claim was to divide the community, composed of the community was composed of about 9 different totemic clan land groups, and divide them on the basis of traditional owners and historical residents, creating an explosive antagonism within the community. That, and again, I explained this in detail in Cunning, that their parents and grandparents had long overcome by knitting these groups together through ceremony, marriage, and what we call the interactive sweat or the census of the land. Okay. So this was long brewing, right, and became explosive when this claim was finally settled in 2005, and then various kinds of violence started breaking out between these groups on the communities. Very small community, everyone's related, but very small. In 2007, right after a very serious series of violent acts, the intervention was passed by the federal government. So this is much later. It is technically called the Northern Territory National Emergency Response Act of 2007. And it was fueled by, it was pushed by the white nostalgic Howard government. And by that I mean there was a prime minister who's long serving, John Howard, who explicitly dreamt for and tried to recreate a pre-multicultural Australia. And every time he went up for election, he would throw someone over the boat to inspire panics. Once, literally, he used the migrants, illegal migrants, as a fuel. But in 2007, in the middle of an election in which he was losing, the Howard federal government, forced the Northern Territory government, which was a labor government, to release a report commissioned by the Northern Territory to look at the status of children in remote indigenous communities. That report stated that in the worst case scenario, there was sexual abuse of children on indigenous communities. what's important here? There were no comparative numbers. It wasn't like, well, you know, X amount in white communities, X amount in indigenous communities, X amount in suburbs, X amount in cities. No, it just was a statement in the worst case scenario. There's no comparative numbers. There were no numbers. There was no quantitative data released. John Howard used this to stoke a cultural panic through a sex panic, in which he argued that the legacy of legislation like the Land Rights Act and all of the progressive self-determination modes of legislation that followed it supported a tradition of sexual abuse. Right? And he implicated anthropologists, he implicated, you know, the white enablers. So there were the bad sex abusers whose culture was doing this, and then the white enablers. On the basis of this, and it was really a sex panic. I'd never been in a sex panic. You know, for all of my queerness, I'd never been in one. It's like, or I'd never felt implicated in it, to be honest. And a sex panic is, there's nothing you can say to it. So you could say, you know, we were all anxious. We could say, there's no comparative number. So you support the sexual abuse of children. I mean, it's just like, so it's really important to understand the national nature of this. On the basis of having inflamed this, the Howard government passed the Northern Territory National Emergency Response Act of 2007. What to know? That legislation there was nothing in the legislation for child health care, nor anything in it related to child sexual health. Instead, it authorized the Army and medical teams to go into indigenous communities and do forcible medical exams, to take over the computers. It seized lands, right? So it overturned whatever it could in terms of the legacy of the Land Rights Act, forcing communities to open their lands to extractive capital, and it imposed income to the control of income. Did other things more symbolic and thus equally important and vital. For instance, every place that was designated indigenous land, anywhere that there was indigenous land, when you entered it from a road, there was a, I would say, 8-foot by 5-foot sign, blue sign, that announced it was a prohibited area for pornography and alcohol. So in essence, it said, this is a perverse area which cannot be treated normally. It is a place in which pornography and culture rapes children through substance abuse. Now, the irony was, for some of us, is that because these signs had to go up wherever the roads hit a piece of indigenous land, suddenly we thought, oh, I didn't know this was indigenous land. Whose indigenous land is this? You suddenly think, oh, wow, there's a lot more than we thought. Okay, these two structures of what I call late settler colonialism are the new names or the new forms of an original and ongoing ambivalence of the liberal colonial question about who and what can enter the kingdom of the human. And here I'm referring to, obviously, to Sylvia Wynter and Denise De Silva's work, as well as my own and others. But it's not an ambivalence in liberalism. It's an understanding within late liberal settler colonialism that to let in certain kinds of humans is to let in certain kinds of analytics that are disruptive to the governance of difference in capitalism, necessary for the accumulation of value in some communities and the dispossession of others. Right. Now, this specific combination of land rights that claim to recognize but function to divide communities, and the intervention that claimed to protect children in order to open lands to extractive capitalism, This particular combination hit the Belyuen community, the one right across from Harbor, in a particularly violent way that left about 30 to 40 people from that community, which is only about 200 people, homeless, sitting around a fire at Bogle, about 250 kilometers south by southwest, having become strangers in their own land, right? And so by 2009, they had been homeless for 2 years. In those 2 years, and they said, you know, Beth, what are you going to do? You're going to go back to Belyuen and just, you know, act like nothing happened? Or, and I said, no. Now I'll be commuting back and forth to my tent. Right? Over those 2 years, we had been discussing how to keep this group from sliding off the edge of the world, from a precarity, one kind of precarity, becoming another kind of precarity. And again, there's a lot of substance abuse. We all know it. So how to keep this group of people not only alive, but engaged, forward, and together in their analytics about how the world is and thus should be. Over those 2 years, we had been developing this idea of a GPS, GIS-based video project to create a kind of green tourism that would function as an anti-mining income. So rather than open their land to mining, which the intervention was pressuring everyone to do, we would generate some income through this kind of green tourism. So, you know, you guys all know what a GPS, GIS-based video thing dings off a satellite. Also, look at the last chapter of Geontologies. During that moment, as we're all, you know, this is 2 years leading up to that fire. During that moment, we had to decide, okay, if we're going to do this, we have to incorporate. So there's a, you know, you got to have a mechanism for monetary income and expenditure. And the question of, well, who are we? What should we call ourselves? Remember, 7 clans, 7 totems, 5 language groups. And as we sat around, every time we thought, well, we'll say Mobiluk, which is a place of 2 totemic groups, and it's a clan area. If we say Mobiluk, then we're excluding Bonagaya mob, we're excluding Bonakula mob, we're excluding Bogo mob, who are in this group of 30 to 40 people. We are participating in the logics of settler colonial division. So we can't do that. So we're sitting around and we, you know, this is an active thing. Well, if we think that there are these modes of connectivity, I'll come back to that, that subtend ownership, then how do we not participate in the settler logic of property? At some moment, and we really can't remember quite who, I remember it as Cecilia Lewis. Someone said, well, we all got salt water. We should call ourselves Wutar, which is the Emmy term for salt water. And then I remember Cecilia saying, we should say Karabing. And Karabing is an Emmy term that refers to when the tide is at its lowest and is about to turn back. It's paired with Karakal, which when tide at the highest, about to return to the sea. Both of them are good. It's not marked by, you know, Karabing, you know, low, it doesn't have that connotation. And everyone immediately said yes, because Karabing is where most of the totems live, in the salt water or near the salt water, not all of them. Karabing connects as it differentiates. And that's how Karabing started. It started both as a concept, it's a word, but it's a concept. And a concept toward a political imaginary meant to refuse the proprietary logics of the settler state embedded in both the Land Rights Act and subsequent state-based, quote, recognition logics, and explicit capitalist programs like the intervention. The Cottabing Film Collective started in 2009. So if we started Cottabing 2008, we're not good at these dates. That's not what we do. But anyways, let's say we started Cottabing in 2008 or something to work on this GPS project. The Film Collective started in around 2009. That day we were sitting at the fire. Why? Because the local public television station wanted to do a positive story on Indigenous life in the midst of this ongoing sex panic, this nationally broadcast every day, another story about Indigenous dysfunction. And the local TV station was coming down to do a little story, and it was blocked by another set of state recognized traditional owners. And as we sat there and thought, you know what, this is impossible, we should just all give up. People who want to hang themselves can hang, and this is serious, hang themselves, want to hang themselves. Other people can just we'll just all, and me, I'm not gonna float. So it's like, so, and then Suntu said, let's go hunting. We go hunting, we come back, feel good. And Linda Yarrow said, you know what, to hell with this. Let's tell our own little story. Let's do our own little program. So Cottabing emerges out of a specific set of settler structures, but it is not completely saturated by those structures. Okay. Now, this way of telling the story tells a story in which a film collective, that is a art collective, a group of people who seek to aestheticize in some ways their lives, emerge from the historical legacies and ongoing structures of dispossession, of settler dispossession. And it foregrounds a desire to self-narrate, right? To self-narrate, to tell one's own stories. And indeed, I think that our first two films, in some ways, that would have been sufficient to say that was the ends of what we were trying to do, was to self-narrate. To intervene and say, neither one of these laws represent us. Neither recognition, neither the proprietary logics within recognition, nor the proprietary logics of the intervention. And so our first two films, When the Dogs Talked and Winjidamuru, represent that desire to narrate. And people were very explicit. It was like, none of us knew how to make films. And they were like, I said, well, I think, it was at the moment, I said, well, anthropologists, I think they get a camera and give it to you. And they're like, no way, Beth, we don't want a camera. We want someone who knows what they're doing so we can learn. And so we're all nodding, thinking that's a good idea. And they said, you must know someone in New York. So I got a friend, we came back, and the first couple films, we had a very small production team. It was a cinematographer and a sound person, and then one extra person, like a focus pull person. And we studied it. We studied them. The third film, but it's noting, I'll come back to this. After those first two films, what we also realized was that not only did everyone wanted to tell their own story in their own way, in their own language, in what, no pre-production, but that they also didn't want the production process to that motive of producing story. And what we had found in the first two is that when you use a good crew that's teaching and they're very flexible, they still map out, they have 6 days, they have to show up, you have to show up. And it was like, this doesn't work for anybody, right? That's not the rhythm. So it's like, why? And the younger people and some of the older people are like, why are we conforming to an alien mode of production? So our third film, and we were all like, we're never doing this again. I included, I was like, I'm turning into that white woman who's always yelling and screaming. And they were like, someone's got to be that white woman. So that's when, I think it was Tangerine first came out, which was the first big production film made on iPhone. So I came back and I said, I had 3 iPhones, and I said, we can do this on iPhones. And look, this is a film made on iPhones. It looks really good. We know enough anyways. And whoever the young people agree to be the cinematographers at the end, we'll get the iPhone. Well, that was really good, and that got everybody doing it. And our third film, Wuthar, we made ourselves on our own time. So we usually have like 3 days in which we do the chunk of the work, and then we just fill it out as we're going about our lives. Okay. Now, again, in this way I'm telling the story, production and post-production, I can talk about post-production. Forget pre-production. There's no pre-production. There's no script. There's no prep. There's no anything to our films. All of this, again, starts suggesting that, or starts enclosing this artistic practice into a kind of filmic self-referentiality, as if filmmaking was about and for filmmaking. Yeah, representing it ourselves. But you start just finding the description of what the practice of art or the arts are for, closing in and around art itself. Filmmaking, we can talk about circulation, we talk about reception, all of which will gradually create this thing that then seems to be authoring why we're doing it, to be the subject of, or the object of our desire. But what I want to suggest is that this is not what films and art are for Cotterbeam at all. That, in fact, in the end, nobody cares about we really care about the film. We like watching them, but that's not the end of it. Okay, so I just want to take a little bit, because I think I still have time, to say, begin to explain what are the ends of art, and then how this might implicate an anthropology that thinks about aesthetics, that thinks about art, that thinks about rhetoric, and etc. Okay, so what are the ends of Cotterbeam? What are the ends of the Cotterbeam Film Collective? What are the ends of Cotterbeam? Now, one way of answering this question has to do with what a Cotterbeam aesthetics might consist of. Like, that's not a word we use. That we've heard it now. We've all heard it. But aesthetics doesn't. It's not phonemically aesthetics. It doesn't phonemically work. But we've heard it. We know what it is now. Now, I would say, and we've talked about this a lot, that it's not first and foremost the surface of the artistic object. It's also, and you guys saw mermaids, yeah. It also has to, of course, we think a lot about that surface, and hopefully we can talk about that surface a lot. Since we started making, really folding the entire practice into ourselves, the aesthetic surface has changed, including how and why we do this montaging of image, how and why we use that montaging of image to try and suggest the multiplicity of temporalities within one temporality, and the function of some of these looping storylines. Also, of course, the audio. But the Cotterbeam aesthetic is not a theory of beauty, or even an interest. It's not a disinterest, but it's not an interest in beauty per se, but an interest in the concentration and orientation of the senses, vision, sound, intellect, haptic, smell, etc. Two contexts to this, to their understanding of the how and why the concentration and orientation of the senses to a thing is so important. The first is that we remain a very active hunting group, and two, that we're very oriented to the ancestral present. So first, hunting. What does that have to do with? What does that have to do with aesthetics? When I say hunting, the first thing to know is that I'm certainly talking about the more than human world, crab and wallaby and plum and, everything, bullock, cow, or whatever we call it, but also to the human world, right? We hunt each other. We ask across the human, more than human, what will this thing bite? What will this thing not be able not to bite? That's the most important. What will it be unable to resist even when it knows there's a hook there? Now, to answer what will this thing not be able not to bite is to have engaged, is to need to engage in a deep study of the kind and region of existence that it is. To deeply understand that thing in its multiple environments. Thus, there is a deep disinterest in what will get something to bite. It's a deep interest in what is on the hook. Like, you don't really care if it's a piece of beef or bread or tinfoil or mullet or squid or whatever it is. But you have an extraordinary interest in the tendencies and thus manipulability of the thing that's going to bite it. Okay, so that's really important to us when it comes to our artistic practice. The second has to do with the ancestral present. And it's important, and we were just talking about this last weekend down at Anson Bay, is that the ancestors that populate the region from which the Katabing, those 7 totemic groups come, are characterized in all their diverse stories and their practices that shape the land by a key affect that is jealousy, right? The porpoise is jealous of the wallaby's baby. The owl is jealous of the pigeon song and timing. The young girl is jealous of young men. It's practice. The sea serpent is jealous because it wasn't invited to a party. The blowfly is which you see in the movie, is a manifestation for all this. It's like the meta jealousy dreaming, in which, because the earth and humans are jealous, to release it is to release a uncontrollable, aggressive punishment. Now, jealousy, importantly, encompasses both what other people have, like, you know, the young girl is jealous because the young men have the ability to dress up and go hunting and she wants to do it. The owl is jealous of the pigeon because it has a different song and gets to sing in the morning. So you can be jealous of something that someone else has, but most importantly, you are jealous when intention is moved from you to something else. Jealousy is an attentive, it's an affect of attention. Bait is the trickery one uses for this foundational affect. Now, so why were we a film collective? Well, we're sitting around the fire. The ABC, the public television is supposed to come. It didn't come. JoJo says, Linda Yerwin says, we should just tell our own stories. Okay, that's all sufficient. That's why I might have made the first little short, but why did we become a film collective? Why have we made like 7 now? I don't know if it's 6, we don't know. I think 7, we're making a zombie movie now. Because we all bit. Remember, I said we were making a GPS GIS project. What we noticed as we were doing it is that no one was actually swallowing the bait of us, swallowing the bait, including me. We're all spitting it out. We're like, yeah, we're doing this. Yeah, we're doing that. But we could all say, I don't like it. Why? It was too school. It was too white. It was too settler. It was too much about credentializing oneself. It was too much about not fun, not interested, and having to be absorbed by a structure than to actually be authoring it. What we found when we started making the films is that not only did people bite, but we swallowed that thing whole. Everyone across the generation, not just those 15 adults, 30 intergenerational people wanted to be in front of the camera, wanted to be behind the camera, wanted to act out, have fun, make a statement, and eventually wanted to move around the world and talk more. Right? That is, there was an acted, and again, for us, we understand this as jealousy, right? We like that intention being moved here. Okay, but what were we biting for? Or what were we biting? Now, this is more than simply jealousy, and it's explicit to our practice. And it is the basis of ultimately what these films are for. First, through these films, we are expanding the archive of our memory and practice. And again, I said at the very beginning, those of us around the fire, we grew up together. I've known them since they were like, you know, some of these kids, they were like 8 or something. Some now, you know, a lot of people never been born. I have great grandkids now. We're taught by the same folks, but not all of us have all exactly the same memory. And we found that making films. It's like, oh, I didn't know that part. Oh, I didn't know that part. How could we each know this common area, but be missing these little parts? What had ended up, you were sitting with Ruby when Ruby was telling that story. I wasn't there, right? So the function, what we found is that these films, in the making of them, telling of a story based on, you know, these two, that we come to expand, deepen memory, and thus practice. Well, oh, if that's the case, then our practice has to change or alter. Thus, the aesthetic, surface, image, and sound that you hear is different from the one we hear, see, and we can smell and taste them too, and you can't. Because what we're doing in making of the films explicitly is more aesthetic or a part of aesthesis, perhaps, than aesthetics. That is, we're making ourselves thicker, wider, and deeper in and around the analytics of existence we have, and we think is important as we're doing it. So in the end, it doesn't really matter about the film because we made ourselves. Second, Cottabing is explicitly about the redirection of extractive capitalism. So that we are not making films to finance films, but we're making films to finance an analytic of existence against an extractive proprietary logic. What does that mean? Well, this has to do with, we grew up together, we've known each other, and there's differences, a lot of differences within the group that we can talk about, but the starkest difference is between me as a settler, no matter I come from, you know, my village in the Alps, and them as indigenous subjects of settler colonialism. So no matter our affective relations, and they are deep, I wouldn't, you know, we're family. No matter what we feel, the structures of settler colonialism treat us differently and value us differently. And that value is concrete. It's like cash. It's like a job. It's like a kind of job. So when we made Cottabing, we also made, you know, we're incorporated, and our bylaws state that any any non-Indigenous person has to bring assets to the group. That includes me. And I'm a founding member of Cottabing, right? So what we do is we recycle, like, you know, funds from this talk and other kind of things. We recycle them, they come into this body, and we scrape it off and recycle into making the films. And then the income we get from the films, we use to make the foundation of our understanding of a human and more than human relation. Now, right now, and I can talk about it more, the main thing we're doing right now is making an art residency for ancestors in our remote country. Now, note, it's for ancestors. What's an art residency for ancestors? Well, we're trying to figure that out. The third, I would say the third end of this practice. So note that in some ways it's like the films are just a little part of what we do. And we do them, so we concentrate for a couple of days, then we do little side things. Mainly we're doing other things. We're hunting, we're building roads, we're raising kids, we're doing ceremony. That's what we're doing. And the value of the films recycle into to support that. That's what these films are for. They're not for themselves. Third is the expansion of the Cottabing body and analytics nationally and internationally. Now, this means that this understanding, and I think I've failed to say this all the way through. The understanding is while so Cottabing's like 30 or 40 people. Different people are related to different totems, right, in different lands. But the ancestral stories that created those lands are subtend those, how do we call them? Roan, we say roan, and connected. So you have your own language, your own totem, your own place. Like, you know, Rex Edmonds is a Barramundi from Mobiluk. We know where that is. He's Emiangle. But what formed that land, what gives him the possibility of saying, that's my roan, I belong to it and it belongs to me, is these subtending interconnections of those ancestral movements, the marriages between groups, and the ceremonies that interconnect them. So that is, we understand, is disruptive to the capitalist logics of property, because while you can say, this is my roan land, Rex can say, that's my land, but I can't just think I can do anything to my land because it is connected originally to this other place through the movement of this ancestor, through my marriage, through the birds, the waters, the winds that do not recognize proprietary boundaries. So the other end of our art is to move this analytic nationally, internationally, to try and disrupt this liberal mode of recognition, which is actually, and I'm cycling back to the very beginning, a proprietary form. All right. So what might this have to do? Last thing, what might this have to do with anthropology? Like, you know, this is a lecture about, in an anthropology department, under the extraordinary work of Regna and others, of Boaz and etc. What might Cottabing Film Collective have to do with anthropology? The quick answer is absolutely nothing. A little longer answer would be that in some ways we are trying to, well, actually the short answer is it really doesn't, we don't think of our films as anthropology. Anthropology itself has a very long history of the tension, I thought that was in Regna's introduction, between ethnography as a rhetoric, ethnography as a science, right? That was built into the, you know, early debates in Malinowski's own, you know, the kind of classic Argonauts that got inflamed during the science debates, right, in the 80s, that got turned into a certain split in which anthropology not only thought of itself as a form of writing, that it was, if not artistic, it was textual and fictional at best, to anthropology, the group of anthropologists who understand themselves to be making art, that is, as an artistic, like anthropology as artistic practice. But for Cottabing, the relationship between art and anthropology really, everybody knows I'm an anthropologist, we use me. But when it comes to the film collective, that issue is mute. Another one instead comes to foreground, and that has to do with art as a decolonizing practice. And I'll end by just describing 3 points of that decolonizing practice that I think reflect the ends of art for Cotta Bing. Right? So if the ends of Cotta Bing are to use these stories to expand the archive of memory and practice, to redirect the flows of extractive capitalism, and to expand a Cotta Bing body and analytics to disrupt settler logics of recognition, which are understood as proprietary in their nature. The decolonizing practice of Cotta Bing art reflect that. That is, art should remove the artistic object from the audience as adjudicative subject and turn it toward a pedagogical mission for the authors of it. It should reject the artistic object, in the sense film, but we also do installation, as the object of the practice, and understand it merely as the baiting of a larger and more complex political field, and thus understand the practice as ultimately meaningless unless it is able to feed a mode of analytics that can, even if it not completely, in some small way, disrupt the ongoing, relentless attempt of settler colonialism to, as Glenn Coulthard would say, not only to dispossess lands, but to dispossess a form of relationality between humans and the more than human world. Okay, I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really amazing talk. And we're just figuring out how to do the Q&A now. And we've got a couple of ways we can do it. We've got the chat feature, which I hope everyone can use. So you can type a question directly in there. And then Lindsay and I can pose it to Professor Povinelli. Because there's enough people on here that it's hard for us to see if you use the raise hand function. We're not all on the screen at the same time. So as people kind of take a moment to think about typing out some questions, I did want to ask, kind of really just a small detail about the film itself, which makes a lot more, and I would say different kinds of sense to me now after the talk. And in part, I wasn't sort of remembering, to the extent that I knew it, some of the history that really clearly I see in the film now, especially the emergency or the intervention, which makes a discussion of this looking for the children and what's happening to the children in Mermaids make a lot more sense. But I wanted to ask about the blowfly, which you said is sort of a meta jealousy figure, because I don't really know anything about blowflies. And then the mud, which seemed to pair with the blowfly, and what was going on with mud, other than just kind of, if I'm right, just sort of signifying territory as well, or different kind of resource or something. But
yeah, the mermaid has several kind of subtending historical and contemporary settler issues behind it. The one is the stolen children, which is, we also know is obviously really important in Canada, right? So not only the past stealing of children from their families, but what we're worried about it as a new round of stolenness through this benevolent welfare intervention, right? So, well, we have to protect the children from substance abusing parents, et cetera. And so there's a new wave of this dispossession of humans from each other. The second is indeed is toxic capitalism that characterizes the Northern Territory in particular, Western Australia, Northern Territory, and the toxic tailings left behind. In which, when we made our first film, Winjiramaru, we, in the practice of making, in the moment of making the film, we discovered that this area, we had all grown, we had all grown up hunting in it, drinking the water, was actually contaminated by this radar installation, and we hadn't known it till the police tried to stop us, and we were like, "What?" They're like, "No, that's all that region's contaminated." We're like, "Oh crap!" So those are probably the main two, but also of course the intervention is a mirror form of the abduction of children in the turn of the century through the 50s. In terms of the film, what we hope is that people can follow it. You get a general sense. It's like, okay, there's something bad going on. White people can't go outside, and this young guy who had been used as part of some experiment they're doing, and now he's been thrown out, and he's being taken to this place in which Trevor and Gavin have to decide whether to release the blowflies. Right? You can follow that much, right? Hopefully, yeah. Okay, so, and then there's a lot of things that we know you can't follow. Like we know most people will not know what a pelican sounds like. And most of us think, oh, you probably can't put shapes together to understand how various images relate to each other. But we are doing that because we are teaching our kids who know how to do such things. And so when they're watching them, they're like, oh, is that la la? And then we say, yeah, because we want them to be able to, we think of landscapes like puzzles, like there are all these pieces, you got to put them together. I have to teach people how to do that themselves, so they can be responsive to the land as it continually emerges and submerges. So the mud, this column look, this blowfly, you know blowfly where you have a piece of meat and then a fly gets on and lays eggs? Do you guys, yeah, yeah. So it's like that. But at this place, if you flick the mud itself turns into blowflies, and they're very big. And then they bite you on your teri thungu, which is your lower spine, and you get sores. And this happened during numerous moments. So why do people flick the mud? Right. We all know, we know where this place is. It's not where we showed you in the film, but we know where the place is, why you flick the mud. And why did that first ancestral being flick the mud? And the answer is because someone gets jealous. What does jealousy mean in that case? That attention was not turned toward them for some, or their family for some reason, or their land for some reason. For instance, the first time I learned about this blowfly dreaming was the first year I was here, and it was like, I went in 84, it was 85, and I was woken up and all the older women said, get up, we have to get in your truck, take us to the bachelor. And they were all sitting around this older guy and, don't do it, it's indiscriminate. It won't kill everyone, but it'll kill indiscriminately. And I was like, what the heck are we talking about? And they described the thing. And then they said, and it was Bushmo, who was Emmy, and they said he is jealous because not enough people came to his brother's funeral. That is Munyu. He was jealous, right? And so the blowfly's rage is the affective core of jealousy. Now, why mud? Because when we started to make this, Aiden, who's the main protagonist, I suppose, came up with the basic idea. And then we're sitting around, and Gavin, who's his brother cousin, we were sitting around saying, well, what would happen in the future if white people, it's poison everything and they couldn't go outside? And Gavin said, well, they'd probably just do what they do now, which experiment on us and the land. So it's like, right. So they're going to do, no matter what happens, white people, settlers, going to do the same thing they keep doing, right? Because we study them, we know what they bite. They're going to try and extract from indigenous bodies and indigenous land something to save themselves. So so for us, we understand the relation between the mud, the blowflies, the why, the thing. For you, the idea is like it's unrelenting, but the ultimate agency is in indigenous hands about what they're going to do. Are they going to say, okay, I've had it, like Aiden says, screw this. I'm going to do it. Tired of, they're killing all my family anyways. It's a long answer, but hopefully it helps.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, in a sense, it almost sounds like part of it for like a white viewer is that not having the density of knowledge to know how everything's coming together helps you get the broader point, which is that settler colonialism is going to extract regardless of a reason, in a sense. It doesn't know why it wants it. Maybe.
It doesn't know. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. It doesn't know. It doesn't even have to know. It's just kind of this relentless, and who's the real jealous one? They're jealous of indigenous people. They're jealous of Black people. So that's right. And we're not saying screw you, you can't know. We're actually it's all on screen. It's all in your ear. But we know you don't know. And you can't know. And we're not going to explain it to you. We'll show you, but we're not going to give it away. Yeah, that's the Cotter Bing way. We show you so we can see, but we're not giving this away. Yeah. What are your thoughts about cultural memories influence the land and place? Who's moderating the questions?
I think we both are, but do you want to answer? Well, there's two above Eva, but you can start with Eva since you read it. And
no, I'm happy. Why don't you guys do it and then?
Okay. Andrew was first, so we'll go with that. And he's asking about, you said there's no pre-production. So how does the narrative emerge?
Right. So the first film emerged, literally, Linda said, let's tell our own little story, how both of these things have put us in this impossible place. One of the first things we did, and then I got Liza Johnson, who was then working with, she's a filmmaker, she was working with communities in the US, and they met her and they said, yeah, actually one of my brothers had got a little crush on her, so that worked. But she showed us some basic craft, like, if you're going to do a film the way they want to do it, how you have to repeat a scene and all that. And then it came to the story, and, we said, well, we know the story. The story is how the overcrowding in the cities, and then the removal of any possibility of living the bush. So we want to tell those two stories. And Liza said, well, what's the script? And that became forefront because there's different literacy. There's different modes of English. There's different modes of pre-settler language, right? So if we had a script, then people would be like worrying about the word and who would be authoring that script. Now there's 30 of us and we're all like stubbornly independent. Who would be authoring that thing? So we just said, you know what? We all agreed. You just gonna put it the way you put it, whatever way you want to put it. And they said, well, then we need the little subtitles. Okay, fine, we'll subtitle it. And also, because we've grown up together, if we say we're gonna tell that X story, most of us were in that X story. We're gonna fictionalize it a little bit. So we kind of know how it's gonna go. But we also say, but you can put it the way you want to put it. So we hit a scene and it's like, okay, so like, the scene where Aiden at the very end, he has to decide what he's going to do. He's sitting and he said, why didn't somebody do something about this? So we're just sitting there and it's like, okay. And Aiden's like, what are you going to say? And we were all like, we don't know. What would you say? And so it comes out. The passage where, like in the scene where you see little Kieran, there's this huge fire, right? Well, we were just driving back. I was charged with getting back to school, and there was a huge fire. And he said, "Nana, a fire!" And I was like, "Yeah, it's big." And he said, "No, Nana for the film." So we jumped off, and I said, "Pretend Posey's here," who was the mermaid. And so he just says some stuff before we get suffocated. We jump in the truck, and we keep going. And then later we say, "Hey, Posey, we did this. You need to answer Kieran." She said, "Oh, okay." So she just came up with that before white people, everything was okay. And the poetics was so amazing. It's like, so what it does is allow this collective authoring. So we have collective cinematography, we have collective authoring, we have collective organization of the scene. And each film kind of it usually comes out of somebody has some idea, and then we know the story and we kind of just shoot it along. And it depending on what people do or say or want to do or want to act out, the story goes kind of this way or that way. We do not shoot and find a story. That's a nightmare. But we kind of know what the end's going to be, but we don't really know what the end's going to be, and we don't really know exactly how it's going to get there. So that's how we do it. And honestly, at this point, it's just like we've so shattered whatever kind of normal production. Anyways, but that's how we do it. And it means that we have Cottabingized all aspects of the process. So you'll see so many consistency errors, and we just don't care. We don't care. Whatever.
Okay, so Matthew, you wanted to ask your own question. So, oh no, you just moved on my screen. Where did you go? Ah, there you are, and you're unmuted. Awesome. You go ahead then.
I should. Okay, I've had issues with this mic before. Thank you, first of all. Also, I had the fire scene question, so you just got to that.
Yeah.
But it's all sort of, I mean, the talk sort of helped make sense of things a bit more for me, and I saw sort of how things are interconnected a bit better. And I learned quite a bit, so thank you. I should have written it down into words. I guess that's why it's easier. Yeah, I think the point you sort of raised about esquisses or sort of my understanding about all this is sort of I guess certain ideas or things I was thinking through were even sort of like anarchist frameworks, possibly connected, because this is, from my understanding, it's like, is the process more important than the outcome? And like when I was watching Mermaid, that was the thing, like it felt almost disorienting. Like I felt a bit disoriented at times. And so the sort of explanation where it seems as though everybody's sort of contributing in their own way, and rather than there being a previously laid out script and order of things, that it was sort of going, you're doing it as it went along. I was also like, when I was watching, I was like, how this fire scene was this, like when I watched that, I was like, did they just like encounter this, and were they just like, all right, we got to film something here? Because how do you, like, you can't just like put that together.
That would be hard. We'd get in trouble. Yeah.
And so I guess that makes more sense.
Well, can I say a couple, because these are important points. It's when we shifted from working with, where'd you go? There you are. When we shifted from working with, we'd have invited directors and, just sitting with us. And we shifted from the first two to the third one, which was, the third one was Wu Thought, and it tells the story of a boat breaking down from three perspectives. Why did it break down? Everyone said that Cottabing had shifted from a more conventional, ficto documentary style to a surrealist mode. And here your anarchist mode or whatever. And it's really interesting to us because we keep on saying, no, these are more real. These actually better capture, narrate the analytics of time, of materiality, and of the ancestral present than our previous films. So we say, oh yeah, okay, so there, but that's because we embody that analytics and y'all don't, right? Which is not like bad person. It's more like for us, it's important. And we understand the disorienting. And we really do. We're like, really, you can't follow that? Oh, because you don't know what the pelican is. You don't know, you don't know all these things. But what's interesting to us is that audiences are, and including some amazing indigenous filmmaking, First Nation filmmaking, they're used to, and this is what we're trying to interrupt, they're used to the very structure of narration conforming enough to conventional modes of filmic narration, just having different content.
Yeah.
Right? So that the movement of plot, even if it's experimental, is a movement that you can follow because it is already conventionalized for you. It's been conventionalized for you. And then you just insert different content. And we're saying that that conventionalized form of narration is part and parcel of a settler logic in which it's not merely the dispossession of land, but it's a dispossession of a semiotic order, right? That then is for some experienced as surreal or anarchist, and we get that. And then when we're there, it's really good. When there's more than me, I'm in Darwin. I can't come up to be professor this week. It becomes more intensified because it becomes clear, like when all of us are on the stage or a bunch of us are on stage, is that it's not surreal to us. It's like, no, it's past, and then it's like intensified. And that's what we want. We want minimal plot. We want you to be able to follow the plot, but we want that affect of, we want a kind of distanciation effect, which we don't solve for you.
So is the process then more, the process is then more of the, well, I guess like in that, like tying like ideas like ascesis and everything else, it's more about the process than it is. It's not so much the end result of the film for the viewer per se, but more so for.
Well, that's why I always try and, I have to go fast, and I always try and say it is also the film, right?
Okay, yeah.
So that you could say there's this movement of forces of distanciation and instantiation going on at the same time that we think is important.
Mm.
The distanciation going toward y'all, and we think so we think very hard about what we show, what we explain.
Okay.
Right? So we are showing you everything. We are basically explaining nothing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we're saying those who need explanation, poof, are outside, will experience a distanciation effect. The instantiating effect is in the process of all of that, of the making, of the expanding of our archive of memory and practice, including when we edit, like what we can show, but we can't tell, what we don't show at all, right? Is part of that instantiation that has as its internal coupling this distantiation, right? In which the audience, which we assume, we assume different audiences. So if it's an indigenous audience in Australia, they really they know like, it's like, oh, that's their dreaming. So we don't know the whole story, but they understand what's going on. They're like, oh, there's a deep thing here. Yeah. Bang, bang. And they know the logics and they know what. So there's this multiple kind of fracturing of instantiation and distantiation. that we think is as important in that distinction is instantiating you as, no, you don't just get to have it. You should say, we're hoping you go, hey, I want to have it. And it's like, well, not yours. But not in a mean way, in a kind of like, yeah, come in and experience that you don't get to have everything.
You want us to want to bite, right?
We want you to want to bite, but we don't want to give you our body of biting. So it's a very, mainly we think about it in instantiating us, but we also do make these to constitute a kind of public that experiences itself as a settler public without you going, well, screw you, I'm leaving. We want you to come more. And if you watch it over and over, you see more things, you learn more, get more, like that. Does that help?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, we will go to Ava's question. Ava's asking, what are your thoughts about cultural memory as influencing aesthetic relationships with land and place? Can the ancestral present root embodied relationships with territory? Does this phenomenon map onto your film work?
Yeah, I'm curious to just a little more of like an expansion of the first question. Can the ancestral present root embody relations with territory? Absolutely. And the ancestral present, well, I tell you what Cotter Bing has done, and Cotter Bing's been really, if Cotter Bing ends like tomorrow, which nothing has to go on forever, but if the film collective should suddenly stop making movies, and we're in the middle of making a zombie movie, so not yet, but should it, it would have, and we all believe, it will have done its work in the instantiating side, in the sense that in order for the ancestral present to root embodied relations with territory, we have to form bodies to be related to the semiotics of that ancestral present, right? We have to, and again, this is a jealousy, we have to get people to attend to it, not only to attend to it, but be unable not to attend to it. We have to bait ourselves and our children. And that's what we've been able to do through the practice of making these films. We've been able to bait ourselves. We usually blame the young people. Well, this is for the young, but ourselves to not only wanting to go to where these ancestral present beings are, which are in this remote area. So, and it's hard work. Like we had to, it's like 6-hour drive. And then we had to bushwhack a road for 15 kilometers. And then we've been kind of cleaning it up this last few weekends. It's sweltering. I mean, it's not like, oh, now I know the story. This goes to Matthew. It's not about, oh, now I know the story. You have to be unable not to do this work, in which then you're there and you encounter things that you then say, is this an ancestral present or not? How would it relate to these other pieces of puzzle or not? How do I, so all of this is the building of subjectivity that is attentive to and unable not to be attentive to not the ancestral present past, not the story, like as a text that you can read, but as a ongoing relationality to each other and the land and these more than human worlds. Cecilia Lewis's sister, Angelina Lewis, whose son is Aiden, who's in Mermaids, took her kids from the community, Belgian community, to Darwin and then to Brisbane because she wanted to get schooling, better schooling. And she came back and she said, you guys, you you don't understand. There's a lot of people who give their like entire arm to still have the stories that we hadn't. And when she's in public, she says, you know, when I was growing up, the stories themselves were just the thinnest thread. They were just going to be cut, let alone people caring, turning to, being attentive to. And she said, Cotta Bing created this thickness and extension that even if it ends tomorrow, the like, no, I'm an X and I've been there and I know if this happens, it's related to that, or if this happens, it's nothing. That kind of attentiveness and caring has now thickened and landed in the bodies of our kids and our grandkids and even our littlest little great grandkids who are just toddlers. So yes, that's absolutely. The film work is all about that, I would say.
Okay, I think we have time for one more. This one is from my colleague Pam Block. She said, would you consider this film to be an example of Indigenous futurism, which I think you've kind of touched on?
Yeah.
Was there an influence from stories like Marrow of the Thieves or Moon of Crusted Snow, or is there no connection? And Kim said she was also thinking of Marrow Thieves while watching.
Yeah, I saw that. You know, it's really interesting. The Indigenous, you know, members are like, they consume TV and media because, you know, in the long, boring days, like there's TV and media. And there in the North, we have some really good Indigenous broadcasting. So we have NITV, which is Northern Indigenous TV. We have CITV, which is more central. And then there were just the blockbusters, the TV shows, and, you know, everything and anything, and news and everything. So we're often asked what is our aesthetic. That's the first time we heard the word aesthetic, or people other than me. What are our aesthetic influences? And like Angie and Kieran always say, anything and everything. And they usually, people, when they say, is this like Indigenous futurism? I myself would say, yeah, it's part of that. But the members say, oh, we don't know what that means. You know, that's not a phrase we use. This is Cotta Bing genre. So, and it's interesting because we've had, you could say like Wuthar it's this multiplex circular structure in which Trevor and then Jojo and then the ancestors give an explanation why the boat broke down, and gets thicker and thicker, and the co-presence of all these temporalities and materialities. And we've made a kind of historical fiction, which is Nighttime Go, and we just made a hip hop film, Day in the Life, that actually won the another Melbourne Prize, yay. And then we made Mermaids. And so there are all these different genres that you guys would say, well, this is, you know, musical, this is ficto historical, this is, you know, this is like Indigenous futurism. But, and we're making a zombie movie now. But what Cotta Bing Sea is underpinning all of that is this a very local mode of narrative co-presence with the ancestors. So whatever genre it is kind of superficial to that. That said, yeah, it's more than, yeah, why not be part of Indigenous futurism? It's a great genre. As whether that specifically influenced, no, I will go and ask if anyone's seen the films, but no, not in particular, no. What influences was the Stolen Generation, extractive mining, climate change, you know, that past, present, and future are all in the same material frame. So our understanding is that the materiality of the world isn't broken into that, you know, classic kind of Western temporality of past, present, future. It's this collapsing of borders. Thanks, everyone.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think we're well past our time, and let everyone here. It's sort of late, and you've got your day in front of you. You know what Thursday is going to be like, and so I'd just like everyone to join me in thanking Professor Povinelli for a really amazing talk and for sharing one of the films with us. It was really amazing to see as well.
And thanks to Regna for putting on, for like really sponsoring and
Absolutely.
talks. Right on.
And Professor Povinelli and Regna, if you can stay on the Zoom line, I'll leave it open for the two of you, and so you can have another moment to talk a little bit longer if you can.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. They all pop, 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 pop.